Hey, welcome to Vinny Malkus Outdoors. I'm here again. Oops, knocked the camera a little bit. I'm here again. This time I'm not going to be talking about water levels like I have been the last few weeks in the Southwest. I'm going to talk about Lake Oahe, South Dakota, the Bassmaster Elite Series event that's going on. I wanted to do something earlier, but it kind of some things got in the way. But I have a chance to do a review, and it's whatever they call it. They call it Showdown Sunday. I can't remember. Or Championship Sunday, where they have the top 10 anglers on there on day 4. And this is a unique one. And first, I want to say, please subscribe if you happen to be watching this. It helps me out, and I throw out some good information here and there, and some good fishing videos every once in a while, some good reviews. Anyway, let's get to it. Lake Oahe is a beast of its own. It's part of the Missouri River chain. I call it the Missouri River chain of lakes in the North Prairie states. That's from Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. You have a number of gigantic reservoirs that are almost virtually untouched outside of walleye anglers. And what that does, is it means that when you bring an event like this, which the Bassmasters has been there one other time, to Oahe anyway. And what it does is it's like a whole new playing field for these guys in essence, which is awesome for the viewer because you get to see these guys that are on the top of the bass fishing world tackle essentially a fishery that most people don't get to see, or a type of fishery most people don't get to see, and how they come about it. Now I'm going to come out in a little different perspective. I'm sure there's a lot of guys that had a lot of takes on when it comes to like fantasy fishing or who's going to be good on these bodies of water. And I happen to have a lot of experience on these chain of lakes, maybe not Oahe in particular, but further up the chain, I do have experience on those reservoirs and like reservoirs in the area. What I'll say is I've watched a little bit of what's going on there. I've listened to a little bit of the live commentary on Oahe. And to be totally honest, they could have done better. They should have brought in some guys that were from the local area to talk about this, because this isn't like well, if you haven't noticed that smallmouth in particular, well, just like you have northern and southern strain or Florida strain largemouth, and they tend to act somewhat different. Smallmouth in particular, when you go to various regions of the country, they have proclivities, they act differently. They're built differently in essence. Like if you go to let's say or in my reference, a Columbia River, or like a huge body of a river system that has some current. I'm sure there's some places in the east, excuse me, where these fish are living in current continually, and they grow big, they eat big, and when you hook one of those, they fight big, but they act a certain way, as opposed to going to, let's say, like a pickwick or something, where the smallmouth there act almost completely different. Now it's driven by a number of factors, and we'll get into I'm going to get into this right now. One, the type of fishery it is, whether it's a reservoir, a natural lake, a river system with current, or a slow moving river system. That kind of dictates some of how these smallmouth act and react. But excuse me, and the type of structure in particular, not necessarily cover in a sense. I mean, cover does, for smallmouth, but specifically structure in a smallmouth's life. And then also, I think one of the greater categories and what dictates what kind of smallmouth you're dealing with is forage base. And not man, sorry for the cough, but not necessarily we're talking crawfish, because crawfish are pretty, it's across the board, smallmouth and largemouth too. They the crawfish is a staple diet, crawdads, and you can go anywhere in the country and a smallmouth's going to eat a crawdad. And smallmouth's going to be around that environment where crawfish are living, their habitat. But I'm talking specifically about bait fish and maybe some other little things. So they go into. So if you go to like a pickwick or something, you have shad primarily. If you go to like a Columbia River or whatnot, you might have different types of shiners, salmonoids, and in some instances, you have like a smallmouth that's more dictated by the crawfish and other hatches. Or if you go down into the Southwest, you couple not only there's heavily shad-based forage, gizzard and threadfin, but then you couple the structure, and then you have a different smallmouth than you would at Pickwick, or if you go up to the northern Midwest where you have, you know, gobies and things of that nature, that smallmouth tends to act differently than the ones in Oahe. I'll just put it that way. So if you're in the St. Lawrence River, well, that's a good one. The St. Lawrence River has current. So, you know, compared to that, those smallmouth are different. But let's go over to Oahe now. Let's talk about that. Now, one thing about the Missouri River reservoirs is you'll notice if you watch this, they're very wide open, prairie, very sloping banks or whatnot with some bluffs. There's some bluffs, and there's some bluffs underwater. And within those bluffs, I mean, one, there's a lot of sandy soil, but on some of these bluff breaks, they have what is, you know, around that sediment, large boulders, smooth boulders, and there's some cases where there's some like flagstone-ish type things. And those boulders themselves are, I believe, I mean, if you mainstream geology is like, you know, ice age type remnants or whatnot. So you can get some sizable boulders, whether they be, you know, the size of a small soccer ball to up where I've seen them, you know, Volkswagen size boulders that are out there in those lakes, and they'll be on some of those bluffs that have been, you know, either wind eroded or, you know, wave eroded or water eroded, I guess is a better term. And you also have, you know, we'll go to the forage base in these, and this is something that is not necessarily something that these Elite Series guys are normally used to targeting, you know, when it comes to looking for forage, and that is the Cisco. Now, if you're not familiar with the Cisco, look it up. It's kind of a long, slender, silverish bait fish, and they get kind of big. In fact, they're big enough for like where like lake trout feed on them a lot. If you're not familiar with lake trout, they're like these giant, they can get giant, like a char-like fish, and they live super deep, and they can, well, they get massive, and they eat other trout and they eat other fish, but they, in these lakes, they target the Cisco a lot of times. But in these lakes too, the smallmouth that have inhabited these Missouri River lakes, especially when you get into that larger class fish, like I'm talking about the 4+ pound smallmouth, that do exist in there that we really haven't seen a whole lot coming out of Oahe in the last two. This would be the second time the Bassmaster elites have been there. There is that class of fish in these, and there are a lot of them. And I'm talking about a lot of them. Might be some of the best smallmouth fishing in the country. I'm just saying it is. It just, you got to know how to target these fish. But anyway, these Ciscos are very pelagic. They run around and they're big. And once you get into that class of fish, the 4 pound plus, they become in these large reservoirs pelagic to a vast degree in a lot of the time of the year. And when you get outside the spawn, when you get into this kind of, when temperatures are starting to roll over a little bit, when you get into, the smallmouth really do get pelagic. And I was listening to the live, and they were talking about how they believe the smallmouth actually at this time in the middle of the day are rising in the water column to a certain extent, but I think they're downplaying that argument. And he was equating it to a grasshopper bite in a mayfly hatch. He's not wrong. He's around the target, but he is wrong when it comes to the class of fish to win an Elite Series event. Typically, like I said, the 4 pound plus class fish in these lakes, particular Oahe and up above it and just below, I think Lake Francis is there. There's another one there too. I can't off the top of my head, but you got Sacagawea up in North Dakota, and you got Peck in Montana. These fish run these Ciscos, these big smallmouth. That's how they get that big, is because they are feeding primarily on these giant Ciscos. And I'm talking about they're big, 5-6 inch bait fish. And this is what makes them unique in this area of the country, is because, yes, you're looking at this vast lake and there's not much to it. Maybe there's a couple boulders here and there. Maybe there's a small rock outcropping. Maybe you can find something on your graph, but these fish only relate to it at certain times. And then they're willing to go out and be in the middle of nowhere chasing these Ciscos. And you got to be able to track them down if you want that 25 to 30 pound bag of smallmouth, which is in that lake, which is in all those lakes there. Like, there's no, to me, I was expecting if they hit it just right, or if somebody really got onto this, that there would be that bag. I think I've seen a 23 pounder bag. And you will run into that just doing what they're doing, because what I've seen so far is they're running Demiki rigs, some small Carolina rigs. Granted, you're going to catch fish. You'll catch those. You're going to run into your occasional 5 pounder, and you're going to actually get into that 3 pound less class, and that's what you're seeing a lot so far in this tournament from all these guys, from what I can tell. Now, where this guy was right about the mayfly and the hopper, we call it the hopper hatch, or it's a grasshopper, because at certain times of year up there in the prairie states, you have an influx of just grasshoppers, and it's big on the trout side of things. But what happens is those 3-pound class fish, typically in the smallmouth and below, they're not big enough to go chasing these Cisco's, right? They're not on that yet. Their primary forage revolves around crayfish, and I believe it's the emerald shiner. I might be wrong on that type of shiner, but there's a certain type of shiner that also exists and is, you know, semi-pelagic, but they run around in a lot of those lakes up there. And those smallmouth will not nail them, and some of the largemouth that live there as well. And walleyes are all over that as well. But they'll hit that, and then at certain times of year, when we get to this part of the year where you do have the mayfly hatch, where you do have the hoppers that are really all over the prairie states, yes, those smaller fish are going to get on that bite. And it is, you can actually go out there and throw, like he mentioned, a small popper. You can go throw a small popper or a small fly, a small grasshopper fly or something like that. Or you can get the plastic, the small ones, and really clean house on the 2 to 3 pound smallmouths or smaller. But typically, you are not going to be in that 4 pound plus range fish, because those fish, now there are exceptions. These are always general rules. But the vast majority of those fish are schooled up or around, you know, a loose school or tight school or whatnot, around Cisco's, because that's their deal. And then sometimes they'll go back, and you'll get lucky every once in a while on those rock outcroppings, because it seems as though they stray far away, and then they come back and they stage on those and wait for the next group of Cisco's, and then they chase them around. And they could be out in 180 foot of water or whatever on the surface. So, I mean, they're hitting the target. They're hitting around the target, but not the exact target. And all it is because there's not a lot of literature on these reservoirs, and there's really not a lot of experience. Now, when coming into this event, and granted, I'm talking after we're on Championship Sunday, I was picking a guy like Brandon Polinick. That would have been my pick for somebody to do really well in this. And maybe he didn't do as well as I thought he was so far, what I could tell. And maybe it's the pressure of being in the AOI race, being the top guy. But that guy has experience in this area, relatively around that area of the country. I know he has some experience on the Missouri River chain closer to his home state in Idaho. But the Idaho smallmouth are different than the ones in the prairie states. You're talking about a different type of smallmouth, a different forage base. That's what I'm kind of getting at. But he does have some experience on there, and I would imagine he would have recognized that difference in smallmouth. And like I said, it has to do with environment. It has to do with predatory fish. But what you'll find here is these smallmouth almost act like, if you recognize like a striper or something. Like, so they're very pelagic, and then they use these rock outcroppings as staging areas. So it's an interesting beast, and I don't think the Elite Series really has figured it out from this stop and the last stop. And I'd love to fish because it would be kind of fun, or some of the guys up there. And some of the guys up there are probably frustrated, or some of the guys I know watching this. I mean, it's fun to watch these guys try to figure it out, but it's like these lakes are not showing. That lake is not showing out to a degree that's kind of frustrating, because we all know that there is 5, 6, 7, 8 pound plus smallmouth that are living in that lake, and not just a couple of them. There's quite a few. There's some really big fish in there. There might be double-digit smallmouth. I mean, I've heard stories, and goes in one of these lakes. There used to, and this is crazy because nobody's talked about this, but I've talked to people who've talked about double-digit smallmouth walleye guys, but then I've also read, there was an article in an Olden Fisherman, and there was a story about, they were talking about these, you know, unheard of lakes, and it might have been a Oahe or a Sacagawea or something like that, but they were talking about this and how one of these walleye guys had actually caught like a 10-something pound smallmouth, and he didn't think anything of it. And I believed it, because I've seen those walleye guys that have done that. They have a giant, I seen a walleye guy, or a pike guy in one of the lakes, caught like the state record largemouth, in my opinion. It was gigantic, and he just like thought it was a trash fish. He just tossed it back. But so I kind of believe it lends some credence to that story, because back in the day when I was growing up, walleye guys are pretty narrow-minded about it. They didn't have the, I guess, situational awareness about bass fishing or whatever. So they were particularly at their walleye, you know, going for those walleye, and just having to encounter like a big giant smallmouth, or because they inhabit some of the same areas that walleye do. But anyway, and they're talking about you know, double-digit smallmouth in these places. They do exist, and it has to do with that forage base. That Cisco is a real high-protein diet. It's very similar, I wouldn't say maybe as impactful protein-wise as a trout, like you do have in like California, where you can go to like what is that, like Berryessa, and have a legitimate shot at catching that 6-7 pound smallmouth, and also the spotted bass and the largemouth and the teens. And that has to do with that forage base. And we all know that, but about the trout and the protein density. But Cisco is a very apt, like close second, in my opinion. It's a very dense fish, and that's why you also get big lake trout in these areas. You get big pike, because pike will eat these things as well. But I guess the closest thing I can see to the Cisco, if I was an Eastern, and I'm going to end it right here because we're at 15 minutes. I can't believe I sit here and talked about Lake Oahe and some of the smallmouth dynamics for 15 minutes on here, but I can go for a long time on this. But if I was an Eastern guy, the best way I could relate these type of smallmouth would be the spotted bass chasing alewives, I guess, where you get a very pelagic, very roaming around, striper-esque type black bass. So so these guys, actually, one of those things, I'm surprised, maybe like a Chris Zaldane. I don't know if he really threw the swim bait a lot, but a guy like that throwing a mag draft in a 6 to 8 inch size, probably the 6-inch size, and running around looking for these pelagic smallmouth. That mag draft's about the same size as Cisco. And I would not have been surprised if I'd have looked at the stats and seen if Chris would have done that. I don't know if he did or not. I don't know the particulars, but a guy like Chris Zaldane out there doing that and strolled a pond and came in with a 25-pound plus bag of smallmouth. Maybe the world would, or bass fishing world would have been very surprised. I would have been like, okay, that's good, but I mean, that's what you would expect from a Elite Series guy fishing a lake that has those type of fish, But they're in there. Don't let these results. Whoa, got a light going. Don't let these results shade your judgment on these lakes. If you have an opportunity ever to go, granted, there's not a lot of infrastructure out there. It's beautiful, awesome place. But you have a chance to go to like a Chamberlain, South Dakota, and fish that area, or go hit Lake Francis or Oahe. It's worth it if you got the money and you got the time and you understand what you're getting into. It's not like these other lakes where there's an easy access to like gasoline or whatnot. I mean, you're going out there, it's big water, like huge water, unbelievable, like huge water. And you can get caught out there in some real nasty weather. But the fishing is awesome, especially when you start figuring out. You can go out there and catch 2-3 pound smallmouth all day. I think some of these guys are realizing that. But once you figure it out on how to target that upper class fish, they're all over. There's an amazing amount of them out there. But the problem is we're fishing for a different type of smallmouth, or a lot of guys are when they go to there, when they don't have that experience on these lakes. They get sucked into those 2 to 3 pounders, and an occasional 4 or 5 pounder will be in that mix. And so we're not really seeing this lake put out the way it should. And maybe one day if they ever do one again there, or have an opener or something in that lake, I'd love to jump into that one because it'd be fun. And it's one of those places where I don't know why people are stacked up on each other, because you can go all over and literally shouldn't see another boat to be in a 100 boat tournament. Like, you should be able to find your own fish and not be stacked up on somebody, because there's a lot of them and they're spread out all over. There's not a lot of tournaments, relocating. And even if you did relocate those fish there, these guys move around a lot. So the fish are spread across the gamut of the lake, and it's just an interesting place. And I wish that we would see it put out, or part of me wishes that, part of me doesn't, because I would like those hidden gems like this lake and the rest of them to stay kind of obscure, and for my own selfish reasons, and other people that live in that area, their own selfish reasons too, to keep the fishing pristine and awesome. But anyway, I'd appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe. Talk to you later. Peace.